Today is the 22nd of September, 2015. The title of this show is Ronald Reagan's Latin American Policy and the Recession of 1987 and the Origins of the Iran-Contra Scandal. Our guest is Dave DeWitt, Athens News, and I am Robert Whaley, retired historian at Ohio University, and this is the Athens Speakout number 347. Last time, we focused on David Stockman's director of the Office of Management and Budget for Ronald Reagan, and he was a three-term congressman from Michigan, elected to the House of Representatives before 1981 when he got appointed by Ronald Reagan to this important post. Now, David Stockman had parents who were old-fashioned conservatives, and they were all fans of Senator Robert Alphonso Taft, the senator from Ohio, who was known as Mr. Republican in 1948 when I graduated from high school. And Taft ran against Franklin Roosevelt for president and lost. And he ran against Harry Truman for president and lost. But earlier, from 1938 to 48, Taft ran as the major opposition to the dominant Roosevelt administration, and he was in a position to be Mr. Republican before Dwight Eisenhower came along. And Governor Dewey defeated Taft in the primary and got Eisenhower nominated in 1952. But the Taft dynasty continues on, and his son became senator, and his grandson became senator. So we've had at least two Taft since, and maybe three. I haven't been able to count them all. Anyway, the duty of David Stockman in 1981 was to gather statistics for Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Treasury, and that is a problem of cutting the pies. We had a little scheme of 10 pieces. The most important is defense. It took up 50% of the budget. And then agriculture, Social Security, and the international debt, the national debt, or the interest on the national debt, became four of the major items. And the other pieces, I arbitrarily said 10, but if you looked at the real federal budget, it had 25, maybe at 100 different little appropriations bills. And what Ronald Reagan wanted was that at least 52% would go for the military, for the Army, Navy, Marines, CIA, and the national debt was sacred. That had to be paid. And then the highways and the agriculture and the food stamps could be cut in order to fit this budget. But that had to be negotiated with Congress, and that was David Stockman's job, is to submit this budget, and then Reagan could tinker with it, and the Democrats and Republicans could add an amendment here and there to get some kind of a bipartisan bill through. And that took a long time. And at the end of 1981, they passed the Kemp-Roth bill. And Ronald Reagan more or less dominated it. And in 1984, Ronald Reagan ran again for his re-election and got a bigger majority. And Stockman had to work on a new budget, a new tax bill called Graham-Latta, named for Senator Graham of Texas. And Latta was a very conservative congressman up in Northwest Ohio, up in the Bowling Green era, and he was in Congress for many, many years. Anyway, they got that budget through, and Stockman then, in doing it, discovered that the budget would never balance. You could not cut taxes, spend more on defense, and balance the deficit and roll back the debt. This was all poppycock. And the so-called supply economics was nonsense, and it was really trickle-down economy. And he eventually resigned, and was the first to resign from the Reagan administration, and wrote a memoir right away attacking Ronald Reagan. Anyway, our first question to the guest. Why did Arthur Lafler's curve, a model for supply economics, why was that a false model?
Well, I think it was based on a false notion that if you could somehow cut taxes and increase revenue to the government, it seems absurd to me, and I'm not sure why so many people. Well, I know why. They did it because they wanted to have an excuse to cut their taxes. But I don't know why I don't know why they believe it worked.
I think that Lafler really believed it would work, and Stockman, when he first got there, thought it would work. But when he fiddled with the figures, he saw that it was nonsense.
Yeah.
Okay, so the statistics didn't match the model.
No.
The model was based on the theory of greed. The model was based on a millionaire gets his first $1 million and he pays 50% on it. So why should he work for another million if they're going to take half the money? It isn't worth it. He can live on $1 million. So he becomes lazy and he sits down and he says, okay, well, I'm not going to work. I'm not going to bother to work on the gross national product. So Lafler argued that if you cut taxes, these millionaires will work harder for the next million, and they will increase the total revenue, and that will mean that you could cut taxes and the revenue would increase, because the assumption is that everybody was as greedy as Lafler. So there's a certain truth to it. But I think that isn't why Bill Gates or John D. Rockefeller work. They don't work for another $1 million.
I think that's the flaw right there, because I don't think that they're going to stop working.
That's
People
right.
like Bill Gates is not going to say, "Oh, I'm not going to work because my taxes are too high." I mean, they're motivated by something much greater than that.
That's right.
And so there's the flaw right there in Lafler's model.
Right.
I think certainly they're going to continue to try to increase their wealth as much as possible.
Well, it's not so much wealth as it's prestige and the glory.
Sure.
So what Bill Gates wants to do
it's the wealth
is
too.
Make another machine that's better than Google.
Yeah.
And
and that's Gates' motivation.
And Rockefeller wanted to make Standard Oil take over from Gulf.
Rockefeller wanted total control. He wanted it all.
He wanted more for.
And he got it.
And he got it. And then when he got so much money, he left it to his son, and then his son divided with his grandsons, and they donated to University of Chicago. They bought the UN, but it got the name Rockefeller. There was a Rockefeller Foundation, and they cured hookworm in Latin America, and everybody loved Rockefeller.
Beyond the money, there's absolutely the prestige of being one of the powerful American families, part of the aristocracy.
Right. So they don't work just to cheat the income tax on the next bill. That's petty baloney.
Right.
That's why Lafler discovered it.
But it created this huge
illusion. Yeah, the illusion.
And this idea that somehow you could, it put the rich people as this middleman,
right,
in the economic system. And as soon as you realize the hoax of it, you understand it for what it is, and that's just an upward redistribution of wealth.
Unfortunately, more than 50% of the Congress don't read the statistics.
No. And and unfortunately, we've been with this false model, this false idea,
right.
For 40 years now, almost.
That's right.
And it's still sacrosanct in the Republican Party. They are unwilling to admit, even to this day, not one Republican presidential candidate is willing to admit the hoax that this supply-side economic theory is.
Right, that is true. Now, the actual facts that Stockman discovered was that when Carter retired, the national debt was $987 billion. And Ronald Reagan, with all of his fiddling around, ended in 1988 with the national debt going up to $2.8 trillion. And now it's up 18, going up to 19. And they got a little clock. And every minute it goes up a couple of $1 million.
And one of the biggest drivers of it, aside from George W. Bush's adventurism in the Middle East, is
That's right.
his tax cuts.
That's
his
right.
Tax cuts have been a huge driver of this because they've decreased government revenue and they've done nothing to replace them. He didn't slash spending. In fact, he increased spending with things such as Medicare Part D.
Well, I guess we've already figured out how this was published briefly in the Atlantic Monthly in 1981. A little bit of suspicion there, but when
the Stockman article,
and the
education of David Stockman,
yeah,
which got him into hot water with the Reagan administration because he said things like, "None of us really understands what's going on with all these numbers." That was a direct quote from the article, and in that article he started to explain how the mythology of this economic model. And that was the beginning of the end for him within the Reagan administration.
But he waits until 1985 to resign after he worked on the next budget. And he said, okay, that's it. I'm going to resign. And he resigned. Then he wrote a book this time. And he published his book in '87 when the Iran-Contra scandal was unfolding.
The book is called The Triumph of Politics, Why the Reagan Revolution Failed. And
And this ties in with Milton Friedman's economics, so I'll change the subject unless you have anything more to say about Stockman.
No, that's fine.
Why did Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago gain ground within the economic schools, economic departments, after 1965 throughout the United States? And he gradually undermined faith in the Keynesian system. Why do so many conservative economists still believe in Milton Friedman? What is Milton Friedman's economics all about?
Well, the Chicago School and Friedman's view of economics, it plays off of this whole supply side thinking.
Well, he reinforces supply side.
And this has been, as you noted, in the mid-'60s, this was developing as a cult among theorists for a while before it really started to gain traction and gain implementation in the '80s. Even people like Alan Greenspan, and he was part of the cult of Ayn Rand, and Friedman, and the whole idea behind all of this was that you could somehow, if you could just make the wealthy wealthier, then it would somehow benefit the entire society. And I think it was, I do believe that they believed in these theories to some degree. But it's a very self-serving, rationalizing way to go about things. Because what you're really looking at doing in the end is rationalizing reasons for increasing your own personal wealth.
Well, the reason why Milton Friedman had some credibility is that Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon spent money and sent up the national debt because they didn't want to pay for the Vietnam War, and they wouldn't raise taxes because that was the easy way out, and the debt kept rising. So then you see, Friedman could say, well, Keynesian economics is false. You can't keep running a deficit. And this is Keynesian economics. But what he leaves out is that Keynes never said that running a war debt year after year,
Right.
it will work.
And not putting it on the books, which has become a very popular way to pay for wars, is to put it on the credit card and,
Right.
and allow
Right.
it, say that it'll come due some other day.
So Keynes said you could have a mild deficit spending, just enough to prime the pump or have a kickstart for full employment, and then you can pay the deficit back when more workers go to work and pay taxes, and that's the multiplier effect.
Right.
If the teachers get a job, they'll spend more money, and they'll collect taxes in the next few years. But it was always small.
Yeah, and that was Keynes's theory, but in practice, I mean, we never really tried that out, did we?
Well, Roosevelt tried it.
Roosevelt did. I'm talking about Johnson on.
Yeah, well, Johnson began to spend on a debt because he thought he would win the war, and then with his victory, he would be able to roll it back. But he didn't win the war. And Nixon had the same theory. Well, I'll win the war, and then I'll be able to roll it back. But that is premised on the theory that you win the war. Now, that's what happened to Adolf Hitler. He had deficit spending from 1933 all the way to 45, but the Germans lost the war, and the Reichsmark was worth nothing.
And the bottom falls out.
Well, the only thing that's keeping the United States alive is that Germany and China and Japan have their own economic problems, and they also go into debt. So now it just becomes a question of who's going into debt more rapidly than the others. And during the Vietnam War, you had the so-called German miracle, which was based on the fact that the Germans and the Japanese only spent 2% of their gross domestic product on defense, and the United States was spending 7%. So they were gaining 3 and 4, 5% every year on the American dollar. And gradually then the yen and the Deutschmark and even the pound or franc were gaining on the dollar, and the dollar was beginning to lose its credibility, and the paper dollars in the reserve began to melt. And then Johnson says, not Johnson, but Charles de Gaulle says, hey, these paper dollars are not as good as gold. I'm going to cash mine in and get the gold. Mm-hmm. Then the Germans did the same thing. So the Europeans established a free gold market, and eventually Richard Nixon in 1971 had to close the gold and will no longer redeem at $35 an ounce the paper dollar, and the paper dollar then is competitive with the other paper money. Mm-hmm. And everybody's on paper now, and nobody knows where it'll ever end. They're kicking the can down the road every 3 months.
But it's all based on credit and
well,
the good name, the good name of the United States.
Yeah, but it's a little shaky in Germany. It's a little shaky in the Middle East. A little shaky in Japan. A little shaky in China. So who knows? It's competitive now. Anyway, Milton Friedman taught at the University of Chicago, and he peddled this idea of debt doesn't matter, and Greenspan just took it to the nth degree. And that's what got us into the 2004, 5, 6, 7 crash. And then Greenspan woke up. Well, he woke up a little bit before. He resigned in 2006.
Yeah,
he saw it coming.
He got out of there before the...
They didn't want to blame him.
The hammer of all his machinations fell
he
on
began
his
to
head.
see...
Although anyone is astute or read can see Alan Greenspan's dirty fingerprints all over it.
You got to have economics 101.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, most people still haven't counted the money.
And the other idea behind all of this was that, and it's notable because you still see it a lot. The whole belief behind the Friedman theory that government should have no role. The government should be
that's not half
uninvolved.
Truth. That's half truth.
And,
he says you cut welfare, that'll take care of it.
Yeah, he wants to cut welfare.
He never cuts the defense budget. That's still sacred.
Right, of course it is. He wants to cut welfare. He wants to create school vouchers. He wants to to get rid of government investment in the economy or any role in regulation or anything like that.
So he called his theory monetarism. Inflation is just caused by the Federal Reserve printing too much paper money. So stop printing the money and inflation go down. Half truth.
Yeah,
because inflation has several causes.
That's part of
it. The Fed
can play a role.
That's it. But it doesn't explain the war debt. It doesn't explain OPEC.
No.
They are secondary and tertiary causes of inflation. So it's a third truth. And these Republicans just want to believe that third and ignore the other 2/3. Okay, well, I think the results then were slightly rocked on my next question, unless you have anything more to say about Milton Friedman. I think he's gradually losing power now. I think Keynes is coming back.
Well, I think it's inevitable, because what we've seen since the implementation of these policies, and I'll never tire of pointing this out, you've all heard me point it out before, we've seen wealth and income inequality explode in the United States to levels that we haven't seen since the first Gilded Age. And we are in a second Gilded Age now.
It's worse than the Gilded Age.
We've seen wages stagnate for 40 years.
Right.
We've seen inflation on everything, largest on higher education and medicine, medical treatment, but inflation on everything else. We've seen the rate of pay for not the 1%, but the top 1% of the 1%, the top 0.01%.
That's the campaign of
Bernie Sanders is nailing it on these things.
That's right.
And they've seen their increase in wealth 10 times.
Right.
And they own more wealth. The top 15 Americans have more wealth now than the bottom 40% of Americans.
Right.
And the numbers are truly staggering. And so what I think we're gonna see with this, and you see this pattern throughout world history, is that when the wealthy accumulate this great wealth disparity and income disparity, and things get so bad for everyone else, the society starts to fall apart. It starts to crack, and there starts to be uprisings, and there starts to be discontent, and a lot of bad things start to happen. So eventually, at some point, the aristocracy, the ruling class, sees all these bad things happening, and they say, well, wait a second, we've got to start to give a little bit back here before everything falls apart and we lose, the civilization. And so that's the idea, is that eventually it's going to get too much, and you're going to have enough pushback that they're going to give a little bit back. And I think the popularity of Bernie Sanders is a good indicator that there's starting to really be a lot of pushback right now.
Now, I discovered that Friedman was wrong. Because I studied under economists who knew the Keynesian system. So I never believed a word of Ronald Reagan. So let me review again. When did you get your BA? Who was president? What year was that?
I was in college during the George W. Bush administration.
Now, did you sense that George W. Bush was a liar from the word go?
Oh, absolutely.
Your mother and father sensed this?
Well, no, my parents are actually all Republican, but my grandparents are all Democrats. Labor Democrats on one side.
So you believed your grandparents?
Yeah, well, they were Labor Democrats on one side and educators on the other.
Right, and they knew that they weren't making the ends meet.
Right. And I never liked, I was heavily into politics when I was in high school.
Good.
I was in Model UN, and I paid a lot of attention, and when I watched the 2000 campaign, I knew that George W. Bush was trouble.
Right.
And as soon as he began, he started picking a fight with Iraq long before September 11th, and I could just tell that this guy was trouble. Right. And everything he did throughout his presidency confirmed it for me. I remember reading the newspaper every day and becoming infuriated with whatever it was that he did that day.
But your mother and father never debated this with you? They didn't try and correct you?
No, I had lots of debates with my father. Yeah, my father is very Republican.
And he's still Republican?
Oh, yeah, very much so. And we used to debate furiously for hours about these things. Yeah.
Right.
He never convinced me. I never convinced him, though, either.
And he
But,
still hasn't. He's still going to vote for one of these Republican candidates.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, he's
Is he going to vote
more
for Trump?
set in his ways than ever. I don't get that impression that he's a Trump guy, although I'm not sure.
How often do you go
he
back
is.
there? You go back to Ashtabula County, right?
Well, there's a different. My mom and my stepdad live in Ashtabula County. My dad lives in Lexington, Kentucky, and he manages.
So they were divorced.
Yeah, when I was like 2 years old, and my mom remarried my stepdad when I was 3 or 4.
Right.
So
So your debate is really with your stepdad.
No, it's with my dad.
Your stepdad doesn't care.
My dad, no, my stepdad's also Republican, but he's much more of a moderate Republican. So is my mom. My dad is a real hardline Republican,
Right.
and my stepmom, for that matter.
Right. So you have good relations with all three.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And all three you can.
All 4, really.
All 4. You
Yeah.
can discuss
Politics.
politics with all 4.
With them? Yeah, I can.
But best of all are the stable grandmothers and grandfathers.
But yeah, my stepdad's parents are Democrats, education Democrats.
Right.
My grandfather was dean of a local branch of Kent State,
Wow.
and my grandmother was a high school
So
teacher.
they gave you the ambition to go to college and get a degree
And then
yourself.
I come from a whole family of educators,
Right.
really. So
Right.
that was always emphasized. And then on the other
and you
side,
did take economics 101 someplace.
oh yeah, yeah, I had to take macro and microeconomics in
Where'd you
college.
get your BA again?
Ohio University.
Ohio University.
I went to the
What-
Scripps School of Journalism.
Oh, the Scripps School. Well, the department here is kind of conservative.
Of the Scripps School of Journalism?
No, the economics department, Vetter and Galloway.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You didn't
yeah,
take their
yeah.
courses.
I actually didn't have Vetter or
Galloway.
Galloway. No, I didn't have either of them. I had...
Doug 80? Jeff Doug 80? He was another right winger.
I don't think so. I had... My economics professors were
Younger guys.
and I can't remember.
And they had a
their
little bit of
names.
Keynesian ideas.
Yeah, but most of my education on economics, I have to say, was autodidact. It wasn't...
You just read the newspaper. the
Yeah,
Wall
it was,
Street Journal.
it was not just the newspaper, but theory, books on, theory. I struck out and read Adam Smith on my own. I
And
read
you read
Keynes
Galbraith,
on my own.
and you read
I
Galbraith.
read Galbraith on my own.
Self-educated, good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good.
And I read as much as I could stomach of Friedman.
Well, I saw Friedman a couple of times on television.
I've seen a lot of those videos.
Yeah.
I watch a lot of YouTube
Yeah.
videos of old interviews.
But they always talk in cliches, Adam Smith, supply and demand. Yes, supply and demand. It'll always write itself, supply and demand. Supply economics. Just stop printing money. Sounds good. Well, I'll change the question a little bit. What were the results of the 1984 election?
The 84 election, that was where Ronald Reagan was challenged by Walter Mondale.
Yeah.
And he really stuck it to Mondale. Mondale didn't do so well.
But the tax issue came up.
Oh, yeah.
How did it come up? Remember that?
I remember that the Kemp-Roth bill was, discussed, and it was bandied about whether it contributed to the economic woes that Reagan saw in his first term. Are you thinking of something more specific?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let us say that Ronald Reagan won 49 states. It was a wipeout for Mondale.
Yes. Yeah.
He was
49 to 1.
He was a liberal Keynesian from the state of Minnesota. And Ronald Reagan won 54,400,000 votes, popular votes. That's 58.9% of the electorate. And he then campaigned on the fact that unemployment was down. He didn't talk about the debt. Nobody knew anything about the debt. And nobody knew anything about Stockman. Stockman is working behind the scenes. Okay. So the majority of the voters couldn't tell the difference between a plebiscite and a free election. Now, let me just define again the difference. A free election is where you have two or more parties in which those parties have equal access to the press. But Adolf Hitler in 1933 had plebiscites. And in 1933, more than 50% of the people voted for Adolf Hitler because there was no opposition candidate. Very simple. And the same thing with Franco. In 1936, Franco overthrew the democratic constitution. 1933, Adolf Hitler overthrew the Weimar Constitution. And Mussolini in 1922 overthrew the Italian Constitution. So you got to have a constitution in order to have democracy. And sometimes voters don't understand that. They don't read any constitutional history. What they do is read polls, and polls are kind of an informal plebiscite. Mm-hmm. They say, well, Ronald Reagan seems to be gaining most of the votes. I'm going to go like a horse race. I predict the winner's going to be. I just want to be on the winning side.
I think that's fed by the media in large part, too.
The media say that. It's in the
Because
bag.
they're very focused on the horse race.
Yeah, right.
Who's winning the polls.
That's what they're
not
saying.
Winning the ideas,
That's
but
right.
winning
That's
the
why
polls.
they say Trump is going to be the victor. Why don't you give up now? And Walker gave up already.
Walker gave up.
Station break.
Okay, we got to stop now. We've been talking about Ronald Reagan's economics, his false economics, which both of us, my guest Dave DeWitt and myself, Robert Whaley, could foresee that Reagan economics would eventually lead to George W. Bush's economics and the present crisis in the economy. Well, anyway, in 1984, Ronald Reagan intensified his majority. He picked up more seats in the House of Representatives, but it didn't change the balance of power. Tip O'Neill still kept an opposition party going, and the American democracy was in trouble, but it wasn't as bad as Germany or Spain or Italy, where it was a one-party system, and we still have two parties, a major party and a minor party, unfortunately. And Ronald Reagan then, there was a little change in the Senate. Robert Byrd became the new Senate leader from Kansas.
West Virginia.
No, Robert Byrd. Robert Byrd came from I'm a little bit confused here. Robert Byrd came from West Virginia and was the Democratic leader.
And Robert Dole.
Yeah,
Robert
but
Dole.
Robert Dole won the majority. So I got the two Roberts balled up. Mm-hmm. And Robert Byrd came from Kansas, and he then became the Republican majority leader and took over from Howard Baker, who retired. And there was a slight change there because Howard Baker was a kind of a moderate center Republican. And Robert Dole was a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, going back to Franklin Roosevelt. He still had a bitterness as an isolationist from Kansas. And he was wounded in Italy, and he always blamed the Democratic Party as the war party. And so he was a bitter man who did not help the Republican Party in the long run. But he looked like Ronald Reagan got him through. And Ronald Reagan told the best joke of his career in that 1984 campaign. Mondale, as the vice president, was a little bit suspicious of Ronald Reagan and raised the question, well, maybe Ronald Reagan is getting a little too old. And Ronald Reagan looked him in the eye, walked over, said, I will not hold your youth against you in this campaign, and I am not going to exploit the age issue. And Mondale himself had a laugh at that joke.
Yeah. Reagan was nothing if not a showman.
Right, he got the humor. But Ronald Reagan also won on the tax issue, because as an honest Keynesian, Mondale said, well, when I get there, I will raise taxes.
That's an anathema to
yeah, well,
American
90% of the Republicans said, well, I don't want my taxes raised.
You know, what's interesting, did you watch the last debate, the CNN debate? What's interesting to me is that whenever this tax discussion comes up, they always talk about, well, raise taxes, not raise taxes, but they never talk about on whom.
That's right.
They never mention who they're talking about.
The Social Security tax, the gasoline tax, the hunting fees.
What they're saying is, I will not raise taxes on the top marginal rate.
Yeah.
And they always leave that little clause off, but it's a very important clause.
Yeah. And also the inheritance tax. Well, we don't want any inheritance tax.
Which is also on the wealthiest people in the country.
That's right.
So what they're promising is to not raise taxes on the wealthiest people in the country.
Right.
They're not really making any promises to the rest of us.
Right, right. So anyway, Ronald Reagan on the surface won a little more strength in that 1984, but it wasn't in the long run decisive. Meanwhile, Stockman is working on the Lafleur Code, and Stockman, as soon as Ronald Reagan is elected, decided, well, he's going to quit, that Kemp Roth is not going to be replaced by Graham Latta. It's going to be an unbalanced budget. And then he just wrote his book, put the facts on the table that the debt was going to go up, and he was the first and only guy who wrote his memoirs. These other Reagan appointees haven't written their memoirs yet of what really happened.
Yeah, he published while the administration was still going.
Anyway, he retired and went into a kind of Wall Street business, and he made money like Mitt Romney did. He went into a couple of small firms, and he made enough to pay his own salary in Greenwich, Connecticut, but his companies were no great success. But he made a reasonable income on Wall Street. Okay, so the Stockman resignation leads to a new topic, because as Stockman retires from the scene, the Democratic Congress is beginning to debate two wars. One in Nicaragua, another one in El Salvador, and eventually that leads to a discussion of some diplomatic problems in Iran, and we have the origins of the Iran-Contra scandal. So let us begin with the Sandinistas. Explain how the Sandinistas revolution took over Nicaragua.
Well, it was a long boiling problem. The Sandinistas were formed as a liberation front against the dictatorship that had ruled Nicaragua for quite some time.
And Anastasio Somoza, a family, who owned 1/5 of the land.
Somoza, yeah, 1/5 of the...
And sold all the coffee to the American market and made all the profits.
Right, and they had ruled Nicaragua for most of the 20th century.
Well, his father was dictator. It
Right.
was actually Somoza Jr., who was in power when Reagan...
When the Sandinistas came along. And the opposition to the Somoza regime built from the 60s onward and really came to a head in the late 70s and throughout the 80s.
Right. Well, who was Sandinista? Why did they call themselves the Sandinista Liberation Front, National Liberation Front? That was the name of the party.
Right, the FSLN.
Yeah. What was their point, other than Somoza is a landed dictator?
Well, they wanted
what was the positive role of Sandinista? Who was Sandinista?
You're the historian. I'll allow you to explain that to us.
All right. Well, I think we have to say that the National Liberation Front is a Marxist coalition front. And we had the Titoists, we had Castro's National Liberation Front, and we had the Chinese People's Democracy. And it is a coalition of socialists, liberals, and hardline Marxists. Now, the Marxists are well organized, and they know exactly how you have an ideology. They are more sophisticated in ideology. And Sandino was an old-time revolutionary who, in 1927-33, had organized a popular uprising, and Sandino was crushed by the American military, the United States Marines. Nicaragua was essentially controlled as one of the banana republics. The Marines went down there and established law and order, controlled the custom houses, and the Americans collected the tax on the coffee, and they sold all the coffee to the United States, and the coffee merchants had the lower class coffee pickers producing coffee at a cheap rate. And that's true all over Latin America. And anyway, Augustine Santino was repressed by the Somoza dynasty, but his name was still heroic for the new Sandinista National Liberation Front for Ortega, or Daniel Ortega. He became the real de facto leader of the Sandinistas in 1970s, okay? So that's the origin of this revolution. So the Sandinistas then had a civil war beginning in 1979, and they actually walked into Managua the same way Castro walked into Havana, and Somoza had to flee for his life, just as Batista had to flee for his life. Because a majority of the coffee workers welcomed Ortega's revolution.
Right. In the 70s, I mean, they were suffering greatly in Nicaragua.
Right.
After the earthquake.
Now, there was a religious element here. What about the Roman Catholic Church? Were they neutral, or they support
Has the Roman Catholic Church been neutral before?
No, the Roman Catholic Church is divided.
Within, amongst themselves,
that's
absolutely.
Right. Within
They've
the
always
French
been.
Revolution in 1789.
They've always been.
Yeah, right. So there's a difference between the parish priest.
There's really nothing quite like a good argument between two
and the nuns.
Angry, mean Jesuits.
Yeah, and the nuns were supported by American, really interested in charity and health and trying to help the poor Nicaraguans. And it was the hierarchy, the bishops and the archbishops, who stayed with Somoza. So there's a class conflict.
Which is nothing, and that's not unusual to have that sort of breakup within the Roman Catholic Church.
Now, you yourself resigned from the Catholics. How and when and why?
Yeah, I was baptized and reared Catholic most of my life.
Well, were your parents, did they understand this class problem, or what?
Well, my parents are Catholic. They
Nominal
both come from Catholic. No, they attend Mass every week.
Okay.
And they both came from, at least my mom and my stepdad attend Mass every week, and they both come from strong
right.
Catholic
and so does your
heritage.
grandmother and grandfather.
Right. And
so that was another one of these.
And I attended Mass until I was 16 years old.
Yeah.
Every week. I was an altar boy.
Yeah.
I did the whole bit.
And you defected when you were 16?
Yeah, when I was 16.
And you just never went to Mass again, and they couldn't enforce it.
Right.
You
That's
just
pretty much the gist
went out
of
with
it.
the teenager gang, right?
Yeah. That's pretty much it.
Okay. Okay. Well, I guess that happens to a lot of young Catholics. I was raised in a kind of a Catholic neighborhood, And
Yeah, there's that.
these boys all hated the nuns. He said, "Oh, you're lucky to go to the public school. Those nuns crack your nickels with a ruler. Are you lucky?"
I only went to Catholic school for 1 year when I was in kindergarten.
Oh, they let
But
you go to public.
other than that, I went to public
That-
school. Well, my mother was a public school teacher and later principal.
So she, in a sense, was on the liberal side of the barricades.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, none of my family are very
Devout. They're not devout.
They're
loyal.
Catholic, they're loyal as far as going to church, but they're not. They're
Not
more
passionate.
what you would call cafeteria Catholics as far as following the catechism.
Yeah, right.
They're certainly more on the liberal
Right.
side of the ledger as far as church doctrine and dogma.
Right.
goes.
Well, anyway, the shorthand slang of the counter-revolutionary movement, supported by the Reagan administration, was Somoza's party, the Somocistas, escaped to Honduras, and they formed a counter-revolutionary army to come back to Nicaragua and overthrow the Sandinistas. So you have two civil wars. The first civil war, the Sandinistas win easily, but then there is a counter-revolution, and that
From
was
the Contras, from
yeah,
the right.
and that was more bloody than the original one.
Yeah.
Right? So that started in 79 and lasted for how long? Do you know much about that?
10 years at least to 89,
Yeah,
right? And
right.
the Tela Accord,
All right, right. Do you have any
the Contra War.
statistics on that? Or why this became, why did this expose the, how did it get into the Reagan administration? Why did Reagan have to deal with this problem?
Well, there was, as happened often throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States lined up behind their respective sides in this conflict.
Right.
They did not have non-interventionist philosophies. They both the United States and Soviet Union liked to meddle. The Soviet Union provided support for
Right. So did Castro.
and Castro
Right.
for the Sandinistas, and on the other side, the United States provided support for the Contras.
Right.
At least, well, I think we're going to get to the fact that there were attempts to limit the amount of support that the United States.
Well, the
provided to the
statistic I have
Contras.
here is that Ronald Reagan's National Security Council in November of 1981 decided to subsidize the counter-revolutionaries. And they killed from 1981 to the end. I guess that's into the Bush
89.
administration. Yeah, it was Bush administration.
Yeah, H.W. Bush, 41.
Yeah, they killed somewhere between, there are no good statistics. The minimum, 10,000, maximum, 43,000. But neither side had any statistics.
Yeah.
It was just
And
peasants,
it's hard, yeah,
peasants
it's hard to
dying
tell.
in
And
the-
there's, yeah, it's
in the
really the civilians who end up, I mean, you have farmers
Right.
and their families who are really getting
Right.
slaughtered by the militants
Right,
in the fields.
right.
This is a pattern that repeats through a lot of these types of conflicts throughout Latin America.
Right. So the Sandinistas then, the news broke. How did that break? Why was Ronald Reagan forced to set up an Iran-Contra investigation committee?
Okay, you want to go all the way to
Well,
the
well,
Iran-Contra, or do you want to cover the
well,
Boland Amendment?
Well, yeah, I think we can go to the Boland Amendment, but I think first I might want to ask you a question about the sources for this. When you came to Ohio University, did you ever hear of or meet Tom Walker?
Tom Walker, yeah.
Yeah, what do you
I
know about Tom Walker?
Well, he's an attorney. Local.
No, he's a political scientist.
Oh, that Tom. Okay, the OU professor, Tom Walker.
Yeah, he's one of the leading experts in the United States on the whole Sandinista revolution.
Okay, yeah.
But you
You're
didn't
gonna
know
have
that.
to. No, I didn't know that.
You didn't know that. Well, Thomas Walker came to the Ohio University in the 70s sometime, and he has the outstanding book called Living in the Shadow of the Eagle. That's the name of his book. It's gone through 5 editions. And his last edition is 2011. He's now emeritus.
Right.
But when he came here, he published the first edition. And he taught in the Latin American departments. And people, he was known throughout the United States. And Noam Chomsky reviewed this book. Noam Chomsky gave it A+. And a man by the name of Wayne Smith, who's in the State Department, who's a left-wing State Department, Latin American Organization of American States, Alliance for Progress type, wants to get back to Kennedy and Roosevelt, an idealist. Well, he used to come around to faculty meetings and support the idea of recognizing Fidel Castro. And he wrote various essays on inside the State Department, read by liberals inside the embassies, you know, the evils of American foreign policy. And the nuns would report and so forth. So there was an underground liberal movement in the United States. They just didn't get into Ronald Reagan's entourage, okay? So anyway, so Walker then was one of my informants on this Central American problem, and he's graduated a lot of students. And as I say, he was one of the major sources, and he's written a second book called Reagan versus the Sandinistas. Came out in 1987 at the time. So there's a lot of sources in there that could have been read at the time. Okay, I think we're ready for the Boland Amendment. What is the Boland Amendment, and how did that play into this?
The Boland Amendment, it describes 3 different U.S. legislative amendments between 1982 and 84.
The first one was 82.
Right, and they all were aimed at limiting U.S. government assistance to the Contras in Nicaragua.
Well, it didn't quite say it that bluntly.
No.
I think you have to go back to Vietnam.
It was part of appropriations because they were included in defense appropriations.
Ronald Reagan actually signed the first Boland Amendment. But he didn't know what he was signing.
What a surprise. I'm shocked.
But I think you have to go back to the fact of the Nixon administration, 1972-74. They were losing the Vietnam, and the whole Vietnam project unraveled. And they had the CIA had Operation Phoenix, and that was being investigated by the Democratic Congress, the Doves. And the congressional investigator was a guy by the name of Frank Church from Idaho.
Church?
Yeah, he was, and they and Kissinger got out of the war through dealing with Hanoi, and Nixon then was impeached in 1974. He won the election, but he lost his reputation as a victor, right? So the Nixon administration then, Ronald Reagan inherits the CIA program. And when they hear about this CIA operation and the Contras, they say, hey, let's pass the Boland Amendment so we don't have another Vietnam. So that's what the original thing said. It said that the Congress will not permit the Reagan administration to finance the CIA in having a counter-revolution in Nicaragua. We don't want another Vietnam.
It was specifically against funds for the overthrow of the government.
Right.
Nicaragua.
Yeah, Nicaragua was that was in the news. And as I say, there was Catholic Church support, liberation theology support, Walker, State Department. There were a lot of sympathizers in the United States with the Sandinistas, just as there were a lot of sympathizers with Castro in 1959, when Castro first came to power and overthrew Batista. So the overthrow of Somoza by Ortega follows the same pattern as Castro's overthrow of Batista. It's always the right-wing dictator who is always for dictatorship. One party, if we have one party and we don't bother to count, they're open with it.
You see this pattern over and over and over again.
Yeah. At least the socialists say, we have a democratic promise in the future.
Yeah.
As the people are...
Well, most of the time, the socialists are democratically elected.
Right.
And then the dictators take over by military coup.
Yeah. So the Boland Amendment said no CIA funds can be used in Nicaragua for the Sandinistas. And Ronald Reagan simply signs it because it's an amendment in the appropriations bill. Well, nobody's going to vote against defense. So it's just unread.
Yeah, it passed.
It goes through
411 to 0.
Yeah, then nobody was going to pick out the amendment and debate it. That's how it gets through. Okay, and now in November of 1986, we have congressional records, and the politics changes a little bit. The November 1986 election. Do you know what happened there?
In the election?
In 1980, the congressional election in 1986.
Oh, as far as the balance of...
Yeah, how did that change? How did it give the Democrats more strength?
Robert, there's 2 minutes remaining.
2 minutes. Well, I guess we'll have to stop with that question. In 1986, the congressional elections make Robert Byrd the majority leader.
Right, they got control.
They got rid of, and now they're going to listen to an investigation. That's the point.
Right.
The Iran-Contra
they get
committee.
The power of committee.
Yeah,
committee chairmanship.
Yeah, they're going to investigate that. Well, we'll have to stop at that point. It's a good point to stop.
Yeah,
anyway,
we can get into that
thanks
next time.
a million for coming.
Thank you so much, Professor. Good to be here.
This program is called Debate. Debate is the auction of democracy. And you and I are great debaters, and we hope that this debate will continue on to the 2016 elections that are getting a little hotter, a little bit moving to the left.
Starting to, yeah.